Please welcome our next speaker, Rami Mounla, a sessions architect. Today he will be presenting DevOps Zero to Hero in 45 minutes. Please stick around after Rami's session for a live Q&A.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to my session. Today, we're going to be talking about the Power Platform DevOps, and hopefully by the end of this session, you guys are going to be heroes in implementing DevOps for the Power Platform and Dynamics 365. I first want to say a big thank you to DynamicsCon for having me back presenting in this conference. Thank you for all the sponsors that actually have made that event possible and this great sort of presentations that we're doing. This is really a fantastic opportunity given the current sort of climate around. So you guys were interested in DevOps. The amount of votes that I got for my session were absolutely unbelievable. So thank you for everybody that voted for my session and wanted to see me again. Now, I have done that presentation earlier last year. The DevOps presentation for the Power Platform and Dynamics 365. However, most of the content in this presentation has been updated, and I'm sort of picking up exactly where I ended in the previous presentation. So let's go through the agenda. What are we going to be talking about today? So first of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about myself and about DevOps. So just to make sure that we're all on the same page and we know what DevOps means and what's coming up in this presentation. Now, DevOps covers a range of different disciplines, and I'm going to cover some of those disciplines at a high level and explain how we can sort of follow best practice within the domain of the Power Platform as well as Dynamics 365. Later on, we're going to have a look at my favorite DevOps tool, which is Azure DevOps. And we're going to see how those different disciplines, coming from, the backlog setup to the builds, the coding, the different releases and so on, how they fit within Azure DevOps and how easy they are to actually implement. And last but not least, we're going to have a specific scenario related to a pipeline. And I'm going to demonstrate how we can do the pipeline in Azure DevOps and how we can actually get the most out of it and minimize any human interaction when we're doing deployments, be it CI or CD, continuous integration and continuous deployment. So what is DevOps? So let's make sure we understand the terminology before we actually carry on with the rest of the presentation. You probably have seen that wheel before. I really like it because it gives you that infinity sign, the fact that things carry on, they continue. So we start with sort of the dark blue side of things, where we're doing the development, dev, and then we carry on in the sort of light green area where we're talking about the operational side of things, the ops, DevOps. So starting from the development, we've got a lot of planning to do upfront to understand what is it exactly that we're building, what is available in the platform, and what needs to be configured or customized. And then we go on to actually doing a little bit of coding, maybe a little bit of configuration, and we build everything that we've worked on. We get a release candidate if you want. We test it, and there are different techniques of doing our testing, and then we go through the release and deployment cycles. Once we're happy with that, we've got something that is live. We go through the operational side of things. We make sure that everything is working properly. We ensure that everything is monitored and everything is sort of behaving as expected. And then once we've got all of that going and we've got a little bit of feedback from the client, then we can actually feed that back into our backlog or into our planning and then start the next phase of the project and carry on. And that's where the infinity sign comes in. Now, last time I did this presentation, there's a couple of things that I did not focus on, which was the planning side of things and the operational side of things. Today, I'm going to cover the planning, but I'm keep the operational out. And that's probably something that I'll cover in a future session if we got the chance to. Now, the last slide from last year's presentation was this one. Terraform, what next? And I talked a lot about what to do in the dynamic space. And one thing that I always say is that as Dynamics or Power Platform developers, we are also Azure developers. So it's very rare nowadays to have a big application that is running independently without all the larger ecosystem, without Azure. So most of the time you need to implement some Azure infrastructure, and you need to complement that with the Dynamics or the Power Platform solution that you've got. And today we're going to see how we can manage both of those in a DevOps pipeline. So my message for today is this. If you want to build a state-of-the-art DevOps pipeline, starts with baby steps. In my last presentation, I showed you a couple of baby steps. Today, I'm going to show you some new baby steps as well. A little bit about myself. I am Rami Mounla. I am based in Wellington, New Zealand, and I mainly work in the public sector. Wellington is the political capital of New Zealand, and as such, there's a lot of government departments in there. So most of my work for the last 15 years have been for the public sector and in the Dynamics 365 as well as the Power Platform. And I cannot stress how good it is to be in this domain because things are picking up constantly. We have never had a downturn or a downtime for the last 15 years. And it's always good to be in this industry, and specifically with Microsoft Dynamics 365 and the Power Platform, which is constantly evolving and constantly providing new capabilities that the customers always love. I currently work for DXC Technology in New Zealand. I am a solution architect there. And on top of my day job, I also have quite a few things that I do for the community. So I run the Wellington Power Platform user group. This is under the Dynamics UG umbrella. So I work with a sort of wider DUG umbrella. And I also run some other conferences such as Power Friday, 365 Saturday, and the Global Power Platform Bootcamp. So we keep everybody busy in New Zealand with those conferences. And we are lucky in New Zealand because we can actually have them in person as opposed to all virtual. A couple of other things. I'm the author of the Microsoft Dynamics 365 Extensions Cookbook. I've written that maybe about a couple of years ago, so it's probably due for an update. But most of the topics that I talk about some of them are covered in this presentation, but also they are a little bit timeless. I wrote the book so that it actually doesn't have to be updated on an ongoing basis, but the concepts are still valid. And one more thing, I am TOGAF certified. So TOGAF is the Open Group Architecture Framework, and it's mainly a sort of enterprise architecture framework capability that is quite well proven and sort of respected in the industry. I'm not going to talk today about enterprise architecture, but I'm going to talk about some of the aspects that I've learned from becoming TOGAF certified, and that's mainly building maturity models. So trying to understand where do you fit in terms of maturity compared to a specific discipline. So this is a good example of a maturity model for business transformation specifically. And as you can see, it has several levels from 0 to 5, not defined, ad hoc, repeatable, defined, managed, and optimized. Optimized being the most sort of expensive and comprehensive level to be in. Managed is basically where the industry standards is or where the recommended target should be. So I thought this is really interesting to have that maturity model. So let me actually put that into the Dynamics 365 context or the Power Platform. So here we have our levels, level 0, not defined, level 1 ad hoc, level 2 defined, and level 3 optimized. And on the left-hand side, we've got the different disciplines. So deployment, version control, solution layering, quality control, testing, source control, environment control, and so on. But I just put a few in there just to give you an idea of what the different maturity models might be. And specifically today, I want to talk about the different disciplines, specifically around deployments. So when we start with deployment, for example, at a not defined level, we can start with something that is manual. So when we're doing a deployment from a Power Platform, we do an export, a manual export of our solution, and then we go and import it into another environment all done manually. If you want to have something ad hoc, which means that every consultant, every technical person will be able to do those independently on their machine. So they might have some shared PowerShell scripts that they run to extract and import and then do some transformations. Something that is a little bit more defined is when you have a common Azure DevOps pipeline to do your work for you when you're doing a deployment. And that way there's consistency in the way it's delivered. And the final one is optimized, where you actually have custom builds on top of what is out of the box with Azure DevOps, but also you have the infrastructure for Azure that is included in your pipeline. And this is what I'll be demonstrating today, trying to build something that is optimized in terms of deployments. Another example that I want to talk about is environment control. So environment control covers sort of setting up all those different SDLC environments, so be it a dev environment, a test environment, a production environment, a UAT, pre-prod, and so on. But quite often we talk about having a golden copy as an instance of an environment. And every time we want to do a regression test, a nightly build, we actually clone that environment, rebuild it from scratch, deploy our solution onto it, make sure all the infrastructure is there and is talking to our instance, and then running the regression test, making sure everything is okay. And once we've got a green tick, then we can say this release candidate is 100% complete. And then it can go into the next environment, which might be a production environment. So we'll talk a little bit about that today as well. Now, as a target, it's usually a good idea to be in level 2, where it's a defined level. However, going to optimize is a good idea, but can be a little bit expensive to get there. All right, now let's go back to our infinity side and let's go into a specific discipline, which starting with planning. So how do we do our planning? Now, there's a lesson learned that I've done when I'm working with DXC specifically, is that we actually have a pre-built backlog that has all the information from Dynamics 365. So we know what the product is capable of delivering at a high level and also to a certain level of details. We've got all the user stories already created into our backlog. When a new customer comes in, they give us their requirements. So the first thing that we'll do is identify what is a fit, what can we reuse out of the box, and those are the user stories get promoted, refined, and then we start working on them in terms of this is the next element that needs to be worked on in context of that customer. And then we also identify the gaps. What is it that we have to build that is not part of the Power Platform out of the box? What do we have to actually introduce? What do we have to configure? What do we have to customize so that we can actually meet those requirements? So we follow sort of the agile, if you want, structure. We start with our epics, our features, our user stories. We've got tasks under user stories, and then we've got some bugs that we raise as well as things progress. And then this is sort of at a high level what our backlog would look like with the epic features, the user stories, the features, and so on. So we sort of manage it in Azure DevOps, and it's a great tool to do it in there because it gives you a lot of visibility of what's happening. We are well-oiled in the way we do it because we already have a pre-built backlog, so we can basically reuse some of those capabilities and carry on. Cool. So the next step that we're going to talk about is the coding side of things. So coding, in the previous presentation, I spent quite a lot of time in here. Today, I'll be probably focusing more on the release and deploy side of things. So let's talk really quickly about some of the coding best practices that I would encourage. So first of all, if you have customization that you're building, make sure that it is layered. Make sure that you've got an entry point, which is usually like where your plugin starts or your custom workflow activity, or even like if you've got logic apps, this is where the entry to your call. Separate that from the business logic. The business logic can be independent, can be unit tested, can be sort of built independently of the entry point as well as the data access layer. And that way, with those 3 layers, you can use many unit testing frameworks, such as Fake XRM Easy, which is provided by Jordi Montanya, one of the MVPs from Spain, I believe. And he built a mocking framework for the organization context, which is typically used to connect to Dynamics 365. So given that we've got that capability and we've got our layers, we can mark our data access layer, and then we can build it in memory while we're unit testing our business logic. So make sure you do a comprehensive set of unit tests to make sure that everything is working fine. You can even do unit testing on JavaScript, but that's a whole session by itself. And then the last bit that I would recommend is to frameworkize things. Now, don't go into the dictionary looking for the word frameworkize. That's a term that I came up with. I coined it. So now I can claim that I'm the inventor of that term. And what it means is actually, quite often, if we want to build something that follows a cookie cutter process, if you want, we tend to re-implement it and reinvent the wheel quite often. So let's say in the public sector where I'm working right now, quite often there is the module that we use quite commonly is the customer service. Customer service comes with case management. Most of the time, the request follow the pattern, request to fulfillment. Request comes in from the public. That request is worked on. There's usually some initial check that all the information is there. There's a little bit of research that is done. There is then maybe an escalation process or an approval process that is required. And there's the issuance of whatever was requested up front. So request to fulfillment, and then it goes to the customer. So we can build 80% of all the scenarios using a predefined framework. Now, rather than actually going and having to customize that over and over again, what we tend to do is to actually build it through a framework that is configurable and then build on top of that. Cool. In terms of builds, I always recommend to use static analysis. So when you're building your code, be it code or be it configuration, leverage the tools that are available out there to make sure that what you're building is of high quality. Static analysis always gives you feedback if you're doing something wrong. ReSharper is a very common tool. SonarQube, PowerSoft for security, for example, Visual Studio has its own. But then if you're doing configuration with the Power Platform, use the solution checker, be it on your Flow or on Power Apps, a Canvas app. The solution checker will actually make sure that everything is working fine. Solution checker also works on your solutions within the Power Platform. So it goes through plugins, it goes through the JavaScript, it goes through quite a few things. So it's always a good idea to use those static analysis bits. Testing. There's heaps of testing that we can do. We talked a little bit about unit testing, but my favorite type of testing is actually user interface testing. And the Dynamics 365, as well as the Power Platform, provides you with a tool called Easy Repro. And Easy Repro is a very nice Microsoft-built, actually, solution that is built on top of Selenium that allows you to do a lot of testing in terms of front-end testing. Now, this was recorded maybe a couple of years ago before the unified interface was generated, but the idea is exactly the same. You can manipulate everything you need front-end just by writing maybe about half a dozen lines of code. So everything that you can see in that little video running now is done through code. So it's creating an account, saving it, and then making sure that account is back into the list, and then giving you a green tick that that solution was working fine, or that piece of testing is working fine. So great tool, have a look at it. Again, like I can spend a whole hour just talking about Easy Repro. It's such a fantastic tool. All right, moving on to the next steps, which is release and deploy. And we're going to spend a little bit of time in here. So a typical scenario is that we have a dev environment. We build something, we unit test it, we're happy that it's all good. And if we're in the early stages of that maturity, we would say, all right, export your solution, push it into a new environment. It could be manual, it could be done through a script, but that's typically how it works. However, if you want to move up the maturity models, then you might want to do something like push it into your repository, your source code repository, be it Git or the TFS or whatever it is. Validate that everything is done correctly. So by running your static analysis, maybe some unit test on the code and so on, and then generate the release candidates or the artifacts once you're happy with what you've got. The next step is to build a new environment, automatically provision that environment using all the tools that we've got from Microsoft. Automatically deploy your solution and run your regression test. So this is the cycle that we would typically do overnight, for example, just to make sure that our solution is working as expected. Now, with Azure DevOps, a lot of those tools are available in the marketplace and are easy to get. So the official one provided by Microsoft is the Power Platform Build Tools. It's actually quite a popular one. There's another one written by an MVP called Wael Hamzi. He's based in the UK, and it's the Power DevOps Tools. Now, you'll notice that his solution is a little bit more popular than the Microsoft one. So you've got about 9,000, 10,000 installs. The Microsoft one is about 6,000. It is catching up, but what I really like about Wael's one is basically it's a superset of what Microsoft provides. He actually added some additional bits that might not necessarily be considered as best practice by Microsoft, but they can come in handy quite often if you've got an environment that is mainly like a dev or test environment where we want to do things in a slightly different manner. So he provides you with additional tools to do that, such as solution manipulation, content manipulation, and so on. Not necessarily available in the official one. Both of them are quite capable, so feel free to go and have a look at both of them. But if you're starting up, I do suggest that you look at the official one. So let's have a look at what's included in the official one. So we've got on the one hand, the helpers, that installs all the tools that are required. The quality check that checks your solution, as we talked about slightly before. The solution-specific bits, which can import, export, package, unpackage, publish, and set the versions of the solution. And the last bits is the environment setup. So allow you to create, delete, backup those environments. And that's really essential to be able to provision an environment from nothing and then build on top of that. Now, as we talked about before, quite often when you're building a large Dynamics or Power Platform implementation, that would be sort of complemented by some Azure infrastructure. And this is what we need to introduce as well, is the capability to build an infrastructure using tools such as Terraform, which is my preferred one. And there's always some cases where it's not covered with the out-of-the-box ones. In that case, what we can do is use PowerShell. So let's have a look at the scenario that we're going to talk about shortly. So we've got an environment, and we've got some Azure infrastructure, such as a queue. When we're actually using the dev environment, we use the plugin registration tool to link the two together. But then when we move to a new environment, we've got a new queue that is created. We deploy our solution, but we're still pointing to the old environment. So how can we actually go and address that? So let's cover that in a demo. All right, so here we are. I've got an environment up and running. In here, I've got a Dynamics 365 instance or Power Platform. It's called NZ21, as well as my Azure tenancy that is also using NZ21. This is the login, so it's all within the same tenancy. Within my Azure environment, I've got a resource group. Resource group is basically a folder that contains a bunch of infrastructure, if you want. And I've got a few queues that I've defined in here, Dynamics Con NZ, Dynamics Con namespace 1, namespace 2, namespace 3. And each one of those, so if I just click on one of them, is going to have a queue. So those were the service buses. Within the service bus, you've got a queue. And within the queue, you also have the shared access policy, which is access defined right here. And that will have its connection string, and it will have the ticks on send and listen. Now, once I've created that queue, I can go and register it using the plugin registration tool. So I go register, and I go new service endpoint. And in this case, we've got that one defined in here. So let me zoom into it. So this is the Dynamics Con NZ, and this is the queue that we already have in there, and it will have the SAS key as well as the sort of access that we're building. Cool. Now, this is one way of actually generating and finding the endpoint. But one thing that I do want to mention is that all endpoints are actually data available in Dynamics 365. So let me go there, and I'm going to go into an advanced find on NZ21, and I'm going to say, show me all the service endpoints. And when I do that, it's going to show me the Dynamics Con service endpoint, which is the one that is defined in here. So that's the same one defined in there. It will have the same name as well. So I'm just copying the name. So I can actually make sure that my query is quite specific to show me the service endpoint that is called DynamicsCon service endpoint. Run the result, and here it is. Now, the cool thing is that now I can download the fetch XML that actually gives me that result. So here it's looking for an entity name called service endpoint, where the name is equal to DynamicsCon service endpoint. So now we know how to retrieve this information using fetch XML. Great. So the next thing I'm going to do now, we've got our infrastructure, we've got our service endpoint created, we've got our sort of plugin that would also have, or the connection to the service endpoint using the plugin registration tool that is also running a step, which is to run every time an account is updated, and specifically when the name attribute is updated. So what does that mean? Every time someone updates an account in the Power Platform, then it goes and writes a message into that queue that will have the GUID, the ID of that record, as well as the attribute name. All right, so what I'm going to do now is create a new service endpoint. I'm going to create a new queue, and I'm going to create a new access for it. So basically, an Azure Service Bus, the queue that comes with it, as well as the access that comes with it. And then later on, we're going to go and update whatever's we can see in the plugin registration tool to have the right information. But all of that is going to be scripted so that you can include it part of your Azure DevOps. So the way I'm going to do that is using Terraform. Terraform is basically a way of actually defining a state that you want for a solution that you're building, and then ensuring that that state is replicated in Azure. In our example, I've got an esbq.tf Terraform. So let's see what is in there. So in here, we've got a bunch of variables that I cover in a second. I'm retrieving an Azure service, an Azure resource group. This is by using the keyword data. And then in my resource, so those are the things I want to build. I want to build a new service bus namespace. I want to build a new service bus queue. And I want to build a new service bus queue authorization rule. That will have listen and send set to true. So this is basically the infrastructure that I'm building: service bus namespace, service bus queue, and service bus queue authorization rule. All of that within that resource group. How do I know exactly what to call them? They are defined in that TF vars, so Terraform vars file. And in here, I have the resource group that we just saw, and then I'm just appending 4 and 4 to the namespace of the service bus and the queue. So we're creating those new service bus and queues under that specific resource group that we've got, and then we'll see how it's going to create over there. So the first thing I have to do is Terraform init. And by doing that, you will notice that in here, which is the folder where I am, is going to add a new folder called .terraform. And that is going to include all the required resources to actually connect to Azure and then push the information that we need. So the next thing that I'm going to do is Terraform plan. By doing Terraform plan, it's actually going to start generating a state in here, the TF state. It will read whatever is in my TF file. It will merge it with the variables that are available in there. And it will tell me what do I need, what is going to be built based on that new state file in here. Now, this is the first time that I'm running it. So it's going to tell me that everything is going to be built in that specific location. Now, what's the advantage of doing that? Those files can be in your source control. And then when you run an Azure DevOps pipeline, then it's going to take the content from those files and it's going to generate everything that you need in Azure. And you can do that on an ongoing basis. Now, if you change the information in your TF file, it will notice that there is a difference between your state and will go and then create this information or alter it. Now, given, again, this is the first time we're doing it, everything is going to be in create mode. So it's going to create all the infrastructure that we need. So Terraform apply is when it's actually going to start building that. So again, it's building the state in here. This time the state file will remain because we're not just doing a plan, we're actually applying it. We're actually pushing it into Azure. So the first thing it's going to do is just check that everything is okay. And then it's going to ask me if this is what I want to do. I'm going to say yes, go ahead. And then the next step that I'm going to do is actually go onto PowerShell and show you how, now that we've got our infrastructure up and running, how can we actually go and update the endpoint that we've got in the Power Platform to actually have the right link to the new infrastructure that is created. So we'll just give it a second in here. So if you can see it's telling me exactly what it's trying to do. I'm going to say yes in there and push enter. And then once I do that, it's going to go and create it. While it's creating, let's actually jump into PowerShell. Now in my PowerShell script, I can pass all the information that I need in here. So we talked about having the namespace for and the queue for. So those are the ones that are going to go and update the endpoint that we've got in PowerPoint in Power, the Power Platform with. And I've got a little sort of set Dynamics 365 endpoint function in here. What it's going to do is allow me to enter some credentials. It's going to allow me to connect to Dynamics 365 or the Power Platform. It's going to go to Azure and then retrieve that newly created service bus and then get the ID of it, get some additional information such as the URL. It's going to find the endpoint that we've created by doing a get queue service endpoint. So the get queue service endpoint is right here, and you will notice that it's actually using the same fetch XML that we had that look at before. So service endpoint, where the name is equal to that parameter that we're passing in. It will return the service endpoint. So now we've got the ID. And the last one is to update it to have the right information, which is the bit in here. So given the ID of the service endpoint that we just received, update its content, because at the end of the day, it's only text, it's only attributes, it's only a record with all those variables that we've retrieved from the infrastructure. And that's how it's going to work. So as we can see in the background, everything is being created. So very shortly, it's going to tell me apply complete, 3 elements were added. So before we actually run the PowerShell script, let's go in here. Let's have a look at our resource group. Let's refresh the content in here. And hopefully, as you can see, this is our namespace 4 that has been created. It will have the Q4 as well, and it will have the access into it. So let's run our PowerShell. So I've got a few breakpoints. So it's asking me to log in here. Now, obviously, when you're going to put all of that into Azure DevOps, you can pass all those parameters as elements. But just for security reasons, I'm just typing it in right now. But then even the Terraform, when it was asking me for a yes confirmation, you can run that silently as well. All right, so the next step is that it's actually trying to retrieve the service bus. And as you can see, it did retrieve it. So we've got the information in there. Let's have a look at it. So this is the connection string that is coming in, and this is the key, the secret key that is required. The next step is to actually retrieve the information from there and make sure we've got them in variables. So now we've got the service bus URL that is defined separately. We're going to go and find the endpoint that we've got. So this is the endpoint from Dynamics 365, and this is the ID that we were looking for. And then finally, we're going to go through the last step, which is go and update that service endpoint with the information that we've got, and it said updated. So what we expect that if we go in here into the plugin registration tool, we will do a refresh just so that it gets the latest information from our service endpoints. And then when we open it, we'll be able to see that it's been updated to namespace 4 and Q4 as well. So let's go down to where it is, right there. Double click on it. As you can see, the namespace has been updated to 4 and the queue has been updated to 4. All right, so as we saw in the demonstration shortly, we've created a new infrastructure. And we managed to actually run some scripts to go and update our service endpoint in the Power Platform. And then that way we can basically implement all of those automatically, deploy our solutions and make sure that they are talking to each other correctly without doing any manual intervention, building a true automated pipeline. The last topic I want to talk about in the DevOps sort of environment is monitoring. And there are tons of solutions that are available out there for monitoring. We're talking about out-of-the-box solutions. So if you go to admin.powerplatform.com, which will redirect to admin.powerplatform.microsoft.com, you will be able to see that under Analytics and Dataverse, you have tons of information that will help you visualize what's happening in your environment. What are the plugins that are working? What are the system jobs? Is anything failing? And so on. And recently, there have been a lot of PowerShell solutions that have been sort of included, cmlets that will allow you to do your monitoring as well. So for example, give me all the flows that are running, any of them are failing, are they using a lot of resources, and are we running out of space, and so on. All of that can be done through PowerShell and can be automated within builds and so on. So in a nutshell, today we covered quite a few bits, part of our DevOps journey. We talked about the planning side of things. We talked about how to build code following best practice, how to make sure that we test all our environments using automated UI testing or unit testing, how to package, release, and deploy into a brand new environment and make sure that the infrastructure talks with our Power Platform solution. And then finally, we very briefly talked about how we can monitor things. The operational side I left out, and maybe that's a topic for next time. Just quickly before I conclude, a few resources in here that might be of use. So we've got the docs.microsoft, which is quite a phenomenal website that has a lot of information about Dynamics 365 and the Power Platform. Microsoft also released a lot of guidelines on the Power Platform ALM and best practices. Do have a look at them. They're actually quite useful. If you have any questions or you would like to connect with me, feel free to find me on Twitter or on LinkedIn. I also have my YouTube channel where I usually put in small videos about things that I build, similar to what I've done today. If you're interested in the code that you've seen today, on my GitHub repository, you will have the Power Terraform solution that will have a bunch of little scripts that can do things like building logic apps, building an Azure Service Bus, building the resources, and so on. And then the PowerShell that I just demonstrated to actually go and update the service endpoint is also available on GitHub. So a big thank you for everybody that attended my session. Thank you very much for DynamicsCon. And it was a blast presenting in here. I will have a look at all the questions that are in the live chat, and I'll be with you shortly. Thank you very much.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, everybody, for joining the session. Feel free to ask some questions if you've got anything that you would like to share, or some of the experiences that you had that you would like to talk a little bit about. I'm always keen to learn a little bit about what people are doing in a DevOps perspective. Hey, Lynn, how's it going?
I am good, thanks. Rami, a really great session. I've seen your previous session about the same DevOps, but no, I've never get enough of you add more and more content and make the session more interesting every time.
Exactly. It's all about that sort of learning journey and sort of the doing baby steps, which is basically the message from that presentation that I had is, do it at smaller pace and build on top of the knowledge. You will only get better at it. So Lynn, are you guys using any DevOps automation pipelines in your projects?
Yes, we are using Azure DevOps.
I think we might have lost you, Lynn.
Sorry, connection. The Microsoft ones for most of the steps, and when some of the steps are not available in Microsoft out of the box one, we use the ones from the community, and yeah, it is a really good experience to learning. But I have a question. Let's say we're just starting a new project. We're just someone who has never done, who is doing everything in manual level 0. Like for that person, how steep was the learning curve to get into the DevOps?
Yeah, it is. It is a learning curve, that's for sure. So there is a few things that you have to get your head around. There is a few best practices you have to follow to be able to ensure that everything is running smoothly. But there's tons of information available out there that can help you actually get up to speed and deliver quality relatively quickly. The tools that I talked about during the presentation are a great starting point. And the good thing about using those tools through Azure DevOps is that it provides you a user interface with sort of guided inputs on what information is actually required for each one of those fields. So you don't have to worry too much about learning PowerShell, for example, doing it using the CLI, having to script everything. It's actually guided. So you just drag and drop the steps that you want to use. You fill in the information, fill in the blanks, and then sort of, trigger it. And that will give you the information that you need. And then this is how you can start. Now, depending on the size of your project, don't go and do the gold-plated solution. That's probably going to take too much time. It's going to be too expensive, and you're not going to get the return on investment that you need on it. But start with whatever is taking you, like the whole low-hanging fruit, as we say, whatever it takes a long time to implement and is really easy to automate. So tackle those first. And by doing that, you will notice that the velocity of your deployments, of your unit testing, of your regression testing, and so on, will increase significantly. And this is a great sort of time spent, if you want, because you're putting a little bit of effort into it, but you're saving yourself a lot of time down the track. So yeah, definitely a learning curve. Maybe steep in the beginning, but then gradually flattens, and you will get a lot of benefits out of it. Now, the moment you start introducing something like Terraform, which I talked about in this presentation, then this is where the curve goes back up a little bit, because Terraform is a steep learning curve. Same thing if you're doing sort of ARM templates in Azure, which are sort of similar in terms of the capabilities they deliver from an infrastructure building perspective. But then again, like, you learn that you do follow the best practices and so on. And once you've got sort of a couple of them running smoothly, then doing more is really, really simple.
Okay, nice. Other than the DevOps tools that you mentioned in the session, there's one question from the audience. What software tool did you use for the screen share with the red arrow and zoom in functionality?
Yeah, I always get that question. So this is actually a little tool that is provided by Sysinternals, which is basically a Microsoft team that provides add-ons to Windows. It's been around for a while. I think I've been using it since the Windows XP days. It's called Zoomit, so Zoomit. And you can just download it. It's a really, really small file, and you just use shortcuts on your keyboard. Like for me, it's Control-1, Control-2, Control-3, and that gives you the zooming capability. And then by typing in a few letters, you can change the color of sort of what you're doing. And then by holding on the Shift key or the Control key, you can build draw a little rectangle. You can draw an arrow. You can draw a straight line. So yeah, just if you're keen in doing live presentations like that, I do recommend that you download it, play around with it, and then once you master it, you'll be able to do some really interesting stuff, especially highlighting exactly what you're talking about in your presentation, your live demo. So Zoomit.
Yeah, sure. Definitely, I'll try to use it for my next presentation. So when you use the PowerShell in the DevOps pipeline, one person in the audience is having issues understanding the API formats, considering system.string and body parameters. So do you have any recommendation on learning more about this topic? This really interested in working with the invoke Power BI REST methods.
Yeah, so this is part of the learning curve, is sort of understanding the quirks of PowerShell. And you really need to not really master PowerShell, but try to understand as much as possible about PowerShell and how to use it. Now, I haven't used the invoke Power BI REST method in the past, but yeah, it's, if you've got a development background, in my case, it's C#. I think about data types and the way I sort of pass in parameters in a specific way that does not necessarily equate to how PowerShell works. So my recommendation in that space is do as much research as possible. If there is something specific that is not working, try and research that, see if there's any information out there supporting you on how to do it. But also understand the fundamentals of PowerShell. Sometimes I tend to do a little bit of cheating. Same thing when I'm using the Power Platform itself, like Power Apps or Power Automate. You get into situations where, in your mind, it should work. It's like you don't understand. I'm doing it correctly. Like, this is a string. It's doing a comparison. Why is it not working? And sometimes it's, when I say cheating, it's more like take a string, concatenate it with another string, then all of a sudden it starts working, like an empty string or something like that. So, in this case, it's, understanding API formats, considering system.string and body parameters. Yeah, so this is, to me, it's a lot of trial and error when I'm using PowerShell. Understanding how to build those APIs, how to pass in the right parameters, how to format them, make sure they are of the right data type, and how they do work. But again, like if you get stuck, so Jonathan is asking that question. If you're stuck, reach out to the wider community, see if other people have similar examples on how they've implemented that, and then try and work on it specifically. I would not call myself a PowerShell expert per se, but I'm sort of get my head around it by doing some research and trial and error, as well as finding examples that are available out there. But Jonathan, feel free to reach out offline. Send me a little snippet if you want, and I can try it on my side.
Great. Yeah, as you mentioned in the session, how it's really great how we automate the whole deployment DevOps pipeline. But can we automate like everything in the DevOps pipeline?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Automating everything is like the gold-plated solution, and like being super optimized and, clicking a button with your eyes closed, or even without saying that, maybe using something like, an assistant and say, hey, can you run my deployment? And, it will do the whole thing itself. But it's all about sort of the benefits that you're going to get out of it, and how difficult is it to actually go and automate the entire thing. And I'll give you an example. Working with the Power Platform is really fantastic. Working with Dynamics is fantastic. But then if you're trying to use the Power Platform and then link that with something like SharePoint, especially a SharePoint list where you've got a user interface behind a specific SharePoint element, it's not really designed for a proper SDLC environment. And as you move from one environment to the other, you might find challenges automating all of that. Mainly because when you're using a SharePoint list and building a Canvas app on top of your list, this is actually using your default environment, which is not SDLC aware. And that's a challenge. Exporting the solution and then re-importing it on another list is also a challenge that requires a lot of hacking into the XML or the JSON that is generated by the solution, and then pointing it to the right environments and so on. So doing something like that is going to be challenging, tricky, and unsupported. So think a little bit about whether it's worth automating or not. Another challenge that I've got, especially when I was doing Terraform with Logic apps as opposed to Power Automate, the content of the Logic apps is difficult to actually implement using Terraform. So you can generate a Logic app, a blank sort of skeleton if you want. You can work on all the different connections and so on, but actually taking it a step further and then deploying the code per se, or the configuration and Logic apps, is also challenging. So there are ways of doing it, maybe a mixture between ARM templates and Terraform. But again, this is one of the bits that could be looked at in a slightly different angle. So automating everything, ideally, yes, if you can. But then if you find that it's actually quite difficult, then think about whether it's worth automating or not, depending on the project that you're working on. If it's a large project, try to minimize the amount of manual steps that you've got, because that introduces risk and it introduces human error, and you want to minimize that risk as much as possible. Similar to when you're doing automation. So in the presentation, I talked a little bit about Easy Repro. And you can also do a lot of things using unit testing in the SDK, calling APIs to go and generate records in Dataverse, calling APIs to go and update those records, which then triggers a bunch of plugins, and then you go and check the final result. So all of that can be automated. But one of the projects that I'm working on depends entirely on the user interface to actually get something in the state that you need, because the logic is only implemented on the JavaScript side, on the client side, and not implemented on the backend. So in that situation, our only option was to automate it using Easy Repro. So sometimes, do consider like how far you want to go with your automation on whether you're going to do it backend or front end, or whether there's a few things that are not likely to break, and you have confidence that this is a low risk area, so don't bother automating that bit.
Okay, so before we wrap up the session, what are some of the challenges that would stop you from getting started? Because oftentimes I started and then I think, oh, it's getting too hard. I stop an obstacle and then So what are your advice? And
I think in terms of getting started, it's always a good idea to build on top of something that you've done before. So starting cold turkey is always going to be difficult, and that's why I say do it in baby steps. So build something very simple, such as export your solution and import it into another environment. And then as you've got that, then you can build on top of it. You can add the infrastructure with Terraform. You can leverage something you've done in a previous project and build on top of that, and so on, where it really becomes a plug and play. You've got something ready, you extract it, just add a few parameters into it, and then boom, it's working in another environment. But one thing that I've noticed is that following the DevOps pipeline automation sort of forces you to follow best practices. And I think this is one of the main sort of challenges, or one of the main blockers into getting into it, is most of the time you're doing things not necessarily following best practice, which tends to force you to go against the grain, and then you will find it really difficult to actually use the out-of-the-box tools. So always make sure that you are following best practice. And then when you do use the pipelines, it's sort of putting you in a mindset that, hey, if you did do it the right way, then things are going to be much easier down the track. So do it the right way. Even if it's a test environment that is, 2-3 steps away from actually being into the final production environment, follow those best practices. So my rule of thumb is, if you're in the development environment, then it's a little bit flexible. Because it's a dirty environment, there's a lot of work happening in there. Sometimes you want to cut shortcuts so you can do things a little bit more efficiently. But then anything beyond that, so starting from the test environment to UAT, pre-prod, and then to production, just make sure that you are actually using those pipelines. Once they are built, and then once the best practices followed up front, then downstream, you're going to benefit a lot from that pipeline because you've already used it upfront. It's already saving you time and effort upfront, and then the rest of it is just going to flow. You're going to gain confidence in your pipeline because you've been using it at such an early stage. By the time you get to production, you've tried it and tested it and fixed it and patched it so many times that you have confidence that it is going to deliver. So I think the main challenge is people not following best practice and finding it challenging to actually be able to sort of form things and then deliver them correctly. It's a great way to actually get into it, follow best practice, and just it's a win-win situation from my perspective. It's saving time on releases and things like that. Something that might take maybe 2 hours to half a day to release into a pipeline. Even if your pipeline is slow, let's say it will take 45 minutes to deploy the whole thing. All you're doing is pushing a button and then going and doing something else. So the machine is doing the work for you. And if the machine can do it for you, let the machine do it. Don't waste your time doing it over and over again.
Okay, that's a really good advice, Rami. And there's no more questions from the chat window.
Okay. Well, if anybody else has any questions, I think we've got a couple of minutes left. Feel free to ask them in the chat window. Otherwise, as I mentioned in the presentation, I am, reachable through Twitter or through LinkedIn. Those are my main social networks that I stay on. I usually say all of them. That's all of them for me. But yeah, more than happy to catch up with you guys, and hopefully you guys enjoyed the rest of the conference, and we'll see you at another event. Thank you very much. Thanks, Lynn.
Bye.